I never planned to own a lake, much less kick an entire fishing club off it. But when an HOA president threatens to tow your favorite boat while you're literally enjoying a peaceful morning on your own lake, well, revenge becomes a dish best served wet. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and if your HOA has ever made you consider arson as a reasonable response. The whole situation started innocently enough. As a real estate investor, I'm always on the lookout for unique opportunities that others might overlook. That's exactly what happened 3 years ago when I discovered Pinewood Lake during a property search in a quiet suburban community about an hour outside of Denver. The lakefront properties were gorgeous, but what really caught my attention was the lake itself, a pristine 40-acre body of water surrounded by about 60 homes. After doing some research, I discovered something fascinating. The lake wasn't owned by the city or the homeowners association as everyone assumed. It was actually a separate parcel owned by an elderly gentleman who had held it since the 1970s but was looking to sell. Most investors would have focused solely on the lakefront properties, but I saw an opportunity. Owning the actual lake would give me control over a crucial amenity that added value to every surrounding property. After meeting with the owner, Mr. Jameson, I learned that he'd been increasingly frustrated with how the local HOA had been managing access to the water. What was once meant to be a community resource had slowly become an exclusive playground for the select few who could afford the steep membership fees of the Lakeside Fishing Club. This club, I would later discover, was the pet project of Victoria Powell, the iron-fisted HOA president who ruled the community with a perfectly manicured hand. The lake was always meant for everyone, Mr. Jameson told me as we finalized the deal. When I sold the original parcels around the water, I kept ownership of the lake itself to ensure it stayed that way. But somehow, over the years, that vision got lost. That conversation should have been my first warning, but I was too focused on the investment potential to pay much attention. The deal was straightforward. I purchased the lake at a reasonable price, with Mr. Jameson happy knowing it would be in the hands of someone who understood its true value. I moved into one of the lakefront properties shortly after, eager to enjoy my new investment and the peaceful lifestyle it promised. For the first few months, everything was perfect. I spent my mornings on my sailboat enjoying the tranquility of the water before starting my workday. The previous owner had granted the HOA certain usage rights through an agreement, and I had no intention of disrupting that arrangement. Live and let live was my motto. I was even considering improvements that would benefit the entire community, perhaps better docks or a small beach area that everyone could enjoy. My peaceful existence came to an abrupt halt one Tuesday morning when I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Violation. Unauthorized boat docking. Removal required within 7 days. I stared at it, confused. How could my boat be unauthorized when I literally owned the water it floated on? Thinking it was just a misunderstanding, I called the number listed on the notice. Pinewood HOA, this is Victoria, answered a crisp, authoritative voice. Hi, Victoria, this is Nate Reynolds from 23 Lakeside Drive. I received a violation notice about my boat, but there must be some mistake. I own the lake. There was a long pause on the other end. Mr. Reynolds, the lake is under HOA jurisdiction, and our rules clearly state that only approved watercraft belonging to Lakeside Fishing Club members may be docked overnight. Your vessel doesn't meet our community standards and hasn't been approved. But I purchased the lake from Mr. Jameson last year. I have the deed and... Mr. Jameson had an arrangement with the HOA that transferred management rights to us, she interrupted. Whatever paperwork you have is superseded by our long-standing agreement. I suggest you review your closing documents more carefully and remove your boat before we're forced to take action. She hung up before I could respond. That evening, I met my neighbor, Sophia Martinez, who was outside working on her garden, apparently in violation of some obscure HOA rule about approved native plantings. Don't take it personally, she said when I told her about my encounter with Victoria. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. If your house isn't beige, your garden isn't from her approved list, or you dare to have a basketball hoop visible from the street, you're on her hit list. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived demanding removal of my boat within 48 hours. The letter claimed the lake was under exclusive HOA management and that my unseemly vessel reduces property values and violates community aesthetic standards. As I stared at the letter, then looked out my window where Victoria was standing, taking photos of my boat, I realized this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was time to pull out my purchase documents and see exactly what I had bought. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a battle that would expose years of neighborhood tyranny, financial mismanagement, and ultimately lead to a showdown that would change our community forever. The next morning dawned with perfect clarity, both in the sky and in my mind. After spending half the night reviewing my purchase documents, I knew without a doubt that I owned Pinewood Lake outright. The deed was crystal clear, and while there had been an agreement allowing the HOA certain usage rights, that agreement had specific conditions attached to it. Conditions that, from what Sophia had told me, were being blatantly violated by Victoria's exclusive policies. I decided to start my day as I always did, with a peaceful sail on the lake. The water was mirror calm as I pushed off from my dock, the early sun casting long shadows across the surface. There's something meditative about sailing alone in the early hours, the only sounds being the gentle lapping of water against the hull and the occasional call of a heron fishing along the shoreline. I was about 20 minutes into my morning ritual when I heard it, the sharp, unmistakable sound of someone laying on a car horn from the shoreline. When I turned toward the noise, I spotted Victoria and a man I assumed was her husband Greg standing at the community dock. They were both wearing matching powder blue polo shirts with Lakeside HOA embroidered on the chest, and Greg was holding up his phone, clearly recording me. Victoria had her hands cupped around her mouth, shouting something I couldn't quite make out. With a sigh, I adjusted my sail and made my way toward them, maintaining a deliberate, unhurried pace that I knew would irritate Victoria even more. "Mr. Reynolds," she called as I came within earshot, "you are in direct violation of HOA policy. Remove your vessel immediately, or we will call the authorities." I guided my boat smoothly alongside the dock and tied off. "Good morning to you too, Victoria. Beautiful day for a sail, isn't it?" I stepped onto the dock with a smile that seemed to further agitate her. "This is not a joke, Mr. Reynolds. Your unauthorized boat is disrupting the ecosystem and violating our community standards. The Lakeside Fishing Club has exclusive rights to watercraft usage, which you would know if you bothered to read the HOA covenant." I noticed several neighbors had come out onto their decks, watching the confrontation unfold. Sophia was among them, and she had her phone out too, apparently recording the interaction. Smart woman. "Actually, Victoria, I spent last night reviewing not just the HOA covenant, but also my property deed and the original lake usage agreement. Would you like to see them?" I pulled a folder from my waterproof bag. It's quite interesting reading, especially the part where it clearly states that I own the lake bed and water rights. Victoria's face flushed, but she maintained her composure. "Whatever paperwork you have is outdated. The HOA has been managing this lake for 15 years. Our fishing club members pay good money for their exclusive access." "Your boat ruins the view and damages the fish habitat," Greg added, still filming. "The club has invested thousands in stocking this lake." I nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate the fish stocking, truly. But here's the thing. You've been operating under an agreement that required the HOA to ensure equal access to all community residents. From what I understand, your fishing club is invite only and charges $2,000 in annual dues. That seems to violate the spirit of the original agreement, doesn't it?" Victoria's eyes narrowed. "We decide what's best for this community, not some outsider who just moved in. We've built a certain standard of living here, and your eyesore of a boat and your attitude are not welcome." "I'm a real estate investor, Victoria. I never buy anything without thoroughly reading the paperwork. The lake purchase included all original agreements, and I'm well aware of my rights and responsibilities." I pointed to the phone in Greg's hand. "And since you're recording, you might want to know that I've already consulted with my attorney about this situation." The mention of an attorney caused Greg to lower his phone slightly. Victoria, however, doubled down. "We've already called a towing company. They'll be here this afternoon to remove your boat." I smiled again, this time allowing a hint of steel to show. "That would be trespassing and theft. I'd hate to have to press charges against both the towing company and whoever authorized them to remove property from my lake." "Your lake?" Victoria scoffed, but I could see uncertainty flicker in her eyes. "Yes, my lake. Check the county property records if you don't believe me." I handed her my business card. "My attorney's contact information is on the back if you'd like to discuss this properly. In the meantime, I'll continue enjoying my morning sail." As I untied my boat and pushed off from the dock, I heard Victoria hissing at Greg about calling someone named Derek and scheduling an emergency HOA board meeting. I caught Sophia's eye from her deck, and she gave me a subtle thumbs up. When I returned to my dock an hour later, Victoria and Greg were gone, but they'd left something behind. A large, official-looking sign had been hastily installed at the community dock. "Public, Lakeside Fishing, club members only." Trespassers will be prosecuted. As I secured my boat, Sophia walked over, coffee mug in hand. That was quite a show this morning, she said. Victoria's on the warpath now. She's been calling emergency board meetings all over the neighborhood. Let her, I replied, feeling strangely calm. She's been running this place like her personal kingdom for too long. Maybe it's time someone reminded her that even queens have to follow the rules. As Victoria stormed away, I knew this was just the beginning. When they had first confronted me, I'd been willing to work out a reasonable compromise. But now, seeing that sign on my lake, I felt something shift inside me. If Victoria Powell wanted a war, I was more than prepared to give her one. The following week was a flurry of research and revelations. I called my college roommate, Alex Turner, now a successful real estate attorney, who agreed to review all my documentation. Meanwhile, Sophia introduced me to several longtime residents who shared their experiences with Victoria's increasingly restrictive. The picture that emerged was troubling. What had once been a friendly, inclusive community had transformed under Victoria's 6-year reign into a rigid hierarchy, where access to amenities depended on your standing with the HOA president. The fishing club used to be open to everyone, explained Frank Sullivan, a 76-year-old retired teacher who'd lived in the community since it was first developed. We were sitting on his back porch, which offered a perfect view of the lake. There was a small annual fee to cover stocking and maintenance, maybe $50 per household. Then Victoria took over the HOA, and suddenly there were membership standards and the fee jumped to $500, then $1,000, and now $2,000. And what happens to all that money, I asked, already suspecting the answer. Frank shrugged. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The lake doesn't look any better maintained than it did 10 years ago. The community dock is actually in worse shape. But Victoria's house got a very nice renovation last year, and they bought that fancy boat of theirs. Alex called me that afternoon with his assessment. You're on solid legal ground, Nate. The lake is unquestionably your property. The previous owner did grant the HOA certain usage rights through an agreement, but that agreement had specific conditions, including equal access for all community residents and transparent financial management of any lake fees. So the exclusive fishing club violates the agreement? Completely. And here's where it gets interesting. The agreement had a renewal clause every 5 years, contingent upon adherence to all conditions. Based on the evidence of exclusionary practices, you could make a strong case that the agreement is void due to these violations. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, which was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. I arrived a few minutes early and took a seat in the back, observing as residents filtered in. Victoria sat at the front table with Greg and 3 other board members, including a man I would later learn was Derek Wilson, the HOA treasurer who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Victoria's financial management. The meeting proceeded like a carefully orchestrated performance. Victoria moved through agenda items with military precision, cutting off questions and bulldozing through any dissent. I watched as she publicly humiliated an elderly woman for having wind chimes that were not on the approved list, threatened a young family with fines for their children's sidewalk chalk drawings, and summarily rejected a request for a community garden as inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. The real revelation came during the financial report. Derek reluctantly presented the numbers, which included a substantial lake maintenance fund of over $100,000 collected from fishing club dues. When a resident asked for details on how that money was being spent, Victoria smoothly interjected. The Lakeside Fishing Club manages those funds independently for the benefit of its members. If you'd like more information, I encourage you to apply for membership. A murmur ran through the room, and I noticed several residents exchange knowing glances. Near the end of the meeting, under new business, I raised my hand. Victoria pointedly ignored me until Derek specifically acknowledged me. We have a new resident with a question, Mr. Reynolds from Lakeside Drive. I stood up, feeling all eyes turned to me. Thank you. I recently purchased property in the community, and I have a question about lake access policies. Victoria's smile was glacial. Lake policies are not up for discussion at this meeting. The Lakeside Fishing Club handles all water matters. That's actually my point, I continued calmly. As the owner of the lake itself, I'm concerned about restrictions being placed on community access that violate the original usage agreement. The room went completely silent. Victoria's smile vanished. I'm not sure what you think you own, Mr. Reynolds, but the lake has been under HOA management for 15 years. Yes, through an agreement with the previous owner. an agreement that stipulated equal access for all residents. I'd be happy to share copies of the deed and agreement with the board. Victoria abruptly stood up. This meeting is adjourned. Board members, please stay for an emergency executive session. As the room cleared out, several residents approached me, speaking in hushed tones about their own frustrations with the fishing club's exclusive policies. One of them was Derek, who slipped me his business card and whispered, "Call me tomorrow, there's more you should know." Victoria caught me as I was leaving. Her voice was low and intense. "I don't know what game you're playing, but this community operated perfectly fine before you arrived. Your grandfather knew his place. It's time you learned yours." I raised an eyebrow at her mistaken assumption about my relationship with the previous owner. "Actually, I'm just a real estate investor who did his homework. And from what I've seen tonight, this community is far from perfectly fine under your leadership." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. My husband is on the city council and I have connections throughout the county. This little power play of yours will not end well." I smiled, unfazed by her threat. Interesting how quickly we've moved from community standards to personal threats. I look forward to our next conversation, Victoria. I hope it can be more productive. The next day, I met Derek at a coffee shop in the next town over, his suggestion, to avoid being seen by Victoria's spies, as he called them. As the HOA treasurer, he had growing concerns about the fishing club's finances. "The books don't add up," he explained, sliding a folder across the table. "The club collects over $100,000 annually in dues, but less than 20% goes toward actual lake maintenance. The rest disappears into administrative costs that Victoria refuses to itemize." "And the board allowed this?" Derek looked down, shame evident in his expression. "Victoria has dirt on everyone. Anyone who questions her suddenly finds themselves facing violation notices, fines, or worse. Most of us just try to stay off her radar." As I drove home, processing everything I'd learned, I received a text from Sophia. "Emergency meeting called. They're voting on new lake usage restrictions tomorrow night. This is about you." That night I stayed up late drafting a plan that would have made my corporate competitors sweat. By sunrise, Operation Lake Liberation was ready to launch. Victoria thought she was dealing with just another homeowner she could bully into submission. She was about to discover she'd picked a fight with the wrong person. The morning after my conversation with Derek, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my early days as an investor. Victoria's emergency meeting was clearly meant to solidify her control before I could challenge it, but I had no intention of waiting for her to make the first move. I called Alex and explained everything I'd learned. "We need to move quickly," he advised. "First, let's formally register your lake ownership with the county and notify all relevant authorities. Then we'll draft a formal notice to the HOA board outlining the violations of the usage agreement and your intentions going forward." While Alex handled the legal paperwork, I met with Sophia and a growing group of residents who were fed up with Victoria's regime. We gathered at Frank Sullivan's house, careful to avoid attracting attention. The stories they shared painted a disturbing picture of neighborhood tyranny, arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of rules, and a social hierarchy built entirely around loyalty to Victoria. "You rejected my daughter's application to the fishing club last year," said a woman named Linda, after I voted against her proposal to ban satellite dishes. "My family has lived here for 20 years, and now my kids can't even fish in the lake we can see from our backyard." Another resident, a retired marine biologist named Howard, had offered to volunteer his expertise to help with actual lake conservation efforts. Victoria told me the club had professional consultants handling all ecological matters. Later I found out they just dump fish in twice a year and call it conservation. By midday, Alex had filed all the necessary paperwork and I was officially registered as the lake's owner with the county. We drafted a formal letter to the HOA board detailing the violations of the usage agreement and announcing my intention to create a new, inclusive framework for lake access. I hand-delivered copies to each board member's house, making sure to include extensive documentation supporting my claims. Then I implemented the next phase of my plan, public awareness. I ordered small, tasteful signs reading "Pinewood Lake, private property, community access welcomed," and installed them at key points around the water. I also created a simple one-page website explaining the lake's true ownership history and my vision for inclusive access, with a form for residents to share their ideas for improving the lake amenities. Derek called me that evening, sounding nervous. Victoria went ballistic when she got your letter. She's calling an emergency board meeting tonight and has excluded me, claiming conflict of interest. She's also contacted her husband about using city resources to challenge your ownership. Let her try, I replied confidently. Everything I've done is legally sound. But I appreciate the warning, Derek. Be careful. She's clearly not above retaliation. The next morning, I discovered my boat had been vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "Leave" across the side in bright red letters. As I was documenting the damage for a police report, Sophia hurried over, looking upset. Victoria's fishing club cronies are going door to door telling everyone you're planning to drain the lake and build condos, she said incredulously. And they're saying anyone who supports you will lose all access to the water permanently. I shook my head, almost admiring the audacity of the lie. That's actually helpful. It shows how desperate she's becoming. I pointed to the vandalized boat. And this crosses the line from HOA politics to criminal behavior. After filing a police report about the vandalism, I received an email from Alex containing the complete history of lake ownership and management that he'd uncovered through his research. The findings were even more damning than we'd expected. Not only had Victoria been violating the access provisions, but the original agreement included specific language requiring annual financial disclosures for any fees collected related to the lake. Disclosures that had never been made during Victoria's tenure. That afternoon, I spotted Victoria and Greg hosting what appeared to be an impromptu meeting of the fishing club on their expansive lakefront patio. About 20 people in those same powder blue polos were gathered, looking serious as Victoria gesticulated dramatically in my direction. I waved cheerfully when I caught her eye, which only made her gestures more animated. My phone rang as I was watching this performance. It was Frank Sullivan. Thought you might like to know, he said without preamble. Victoria just announced that anyone seen associating with you will have their fishing club membership revoked immediately. She's also claiming to have documentation proving the HOA actually owns the lake, not you. That's interesting, I replied. I wonder how she explains the county property records and tax assessments. Frank chuckled. She's counting on no one checking. Most folks here just take her word as gospel. Well, that's about to change, I said, finalizing my plan in my head. Frank, how would you feel about hosting a community meeting? A real one, where everyone gets to speak and ask questions. I'd be delighted, he replied immediately. My backyard can fit 30 people easily. Perfect. Let's schedule it for Saturday morning. I'll bring the documentation, you bring the coffee, and we'll invite everyone who's interested in learning the truth. As I hung up, I saw Victoria dispatching her fishing club members like troops, each heading off in different directions around the lake. The battle lines were being drawn, but unlike Victoria, I wasn't interested in dividing the community. My goal was to unite it, just without her at the helm. The next day, formal notices appeared on every door in the community. Urgent, special assessment for lake legal defense, $1,000 per household due immediately. Victoria was trying to use the HOA treasury to fund her personal vendetta, effectively forcing every homeowner to finance her fight against me. That was the moment I decided to escalate from defense to offense. Victoria wasn't just protecting her power, she was abusing her position to punish the entire community. It was time to expose not just her lies about lake ownership, but the entire corrupt system she'd built around it. I spent that evening preparing for Saturday's meeting, organizing my documentation and creating clear, simple presentations that would help residents understand the truth. My strategy wasn't to attack Victoria personally, but to present the facts and let the community decide what kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in. As I worked late into the night, I received an unexpected text from Derek. Be careful. Overheard G talking about having your property reassessed for code violations. They're playing dirty. I thanked him for the warning, knowing that Victoria was running out of legitimate options and resorting to increasingly desperate measures. What she didn't realize was that every underhanded tactic only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about my right to use my own lake anymore. It was about freeing an entire community from years of petty tyranny. Saturday's meeting couldn't come soon enough. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, as if nature itself approved of our community gathering. Frank's backyard filled quickly, not just with the allies I'd already made, but with many residents I'd never met, all curious about the conflict that had been brewing. Victoria had predictably organized a counter-event, a lakeside fishing club appreciation breakfast, but even her loyal supporters couldn't resist the allure of finally hearing the full story directly from the lake's owner. I had set up a simple display of all the legal documentation, enlarged for easy reading, along with historical photos of the lake that Frank had provided showing how access had changed over the years. As people arrived, Sophia handed out copies of a straightforward fact sheet Alex had helped me prepare, outlining the lake's ownership history and the terms of the original usage agreement. At precisely 10 o'clock, I stood to address the gathered crowd, which had grown to nearly 50 people, a significant portion of our small community. I kept my introduction brief and focused on facts rather than accusations. Thank you all for coming today. I know there's been a lot of confusion and conflicting information about Pinewood Lake, and I wanted to give everyone a chance to see the documentation for themselves and ask questions directly. I'm not here to create division or take away anyone's enjoyment of the lake. Quite the opposite. I believe this beautiful resource should be accessible to everyone who lives in this community, just as it was originally intended. I walked through the history of the lake's ownership, showing the clear chain of title from the original developer to Mr. Jameson to me. I explained the usage agreement that had allowed the HOA certain management rights contingent upon equal access and financial transparency, conditions that had been systematically violated over the past 6 years. As I was explaining these conditions, Victoria and Greg arrived with a small entourage of fishing club members. They stood at the back, Victoria's arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression thunderous. Mr. Reynolds is presenting a very selective interpretation of complex legal agreements, she announced loudly, interrupting me. What he fails to mention is that the HOA has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in lake maintenance and improvement over the years, which gives us equitable ownership rights regardless of what some outdated deed says. Instead of arguing, I simply held up a copy of the lake maintenance financial records Derek had provided. The fishing club has indeed collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in membership fees over the years. However, according to the HOA's own financial records, less than 20% of those funds have actually been spent on lake maintenance or improvements. I'd be happy to provide these financial records to anyone who's interested. Victoria's face flushed. Those are confidential HOA documents that were illegally shared. Actually, Derek spoke up from the crowd, surprising everyone, including me. HOA financial records are legally required to be available to all homeowners upon request. I've been trying to make these records transparent for 2 years, but my efforts have been consistently blocked. Victoria turned on him furiously. You're finished as treasurer, Derek. The board will hear about this betrayal. An uncomfortable murmur ran through the crowd. Victoria's mask was slipping, revealing the bullying tactics that many had experienced but few had witnessed so publicly. I calmly continued, my goal here isn't to point fingers or assign blame. What's important is moving forward in a way that benefits everyone. To that end, I'd like to propose a new framework for lake access and management. I outlined my vision: a community-elected lake committee, independent from the HOA, transparent financial management of any maintenance fees, and equal access for all residents, with reasonable usage guidelines developed collaboratively. I also addressed the fishing club directly. I understand that many of you have invested significant membership fees and value your fishing activities. I'm not suggesting eliminating the club, just transforming it into an inclusive organization that any interested resident can join at a reasonable cost that actually reflects maintenance needs. The response was immediately positive from most attendees, though Victoria's supporters remained skeptical. As the meeting evolved into small group discussions, Victoria approached me, her voice low and threatening. You have no idea what you've started. My husband is already working with city officials to challenge your ownership through municipal water rights regulations. We'll tie you up in litigation for years. I maintained my composure. That would be unfortunate for everyone, especially the residents who'd be funding that litigation through HOA fees. I'm offering a reasonable compromise that allows everyone to save face and the community to heal. Why not work with me instead of against me? Because this is my community, she hissed. I've built it into what it is today, and I won't let some outsider waltz in and dismantle everything I've created. As she stormed away, Frank sidled up beside me. Don't take it personally. Victoria's always viewed the HOA as her personal kingdom. Your ownership of the lake threatens that in a way nothing else has. The meeting concluded with overwhelming support for my proposed framework. We established a volunteer committee to draft specific guidelines, with Frank, Sophia, and several other respected residents agreeing to participate. Even a few fishing club members expressed interest in joining, much to Victoria's visible displeasure. As people were leaving, I unveiled the final element of my plan: an invitation to the first ever Pinewood Lake Community Day, scheduled for the following weekend. The free event would include fishing, boating, a lakeside picnic, and activities for children, a tangible demonstration of what inclusive lake access could look like. Victoria's response came the very next morning. As dawn broke, I looked out my window to see an army of fishing club members had occupied the community dock and the main lakefront access points. They had set up tables, chairs, and even a few tents, effectively blockading the lake. Victoria stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, a triumphant smile on her face as she caught my eye. It was a bold move, I had to admit, but Victoria had no idea that this was exactly what I had been hoping for. Sometimes, to create meaningful change, you need your opponent to overplay their hand, and Victoria Powell had just done exactly that. The fishing club's occupation of the lake access points continued for 3 days. Victoria clearly expected me to either confront them directly, call the police to have them removed for trespassing, or back down entirely. Instead, I did something she never anticipated. I ignored them completely and continued preparing for the community day as if nothing had changed. Behind the scenes, however, I was far from inactive. Alex and I documented the blockade thoroughly, gathering statements from residents who were being denied access to the lake by their own neighbors. We also filed formal complaints with the county about unauthorized structures being placed on private property without permits. A delicious irony, given Victoria's obsession with rule enforcement. On day 4 of the occupation, Victoria escalated further. A crew of workers appeared at the community dock and began installing a massive gate with electronic keycard access. When Sophia questioned what was happening, she was told the HOA had approved security upgrades to protect the lake from unauthorized usage. That was the legal trigger I had been waiting for. Alex immediately filed for an emergency injunction, citing construction on private property without owner consent. By that afternoon, a county sheriff and a representative from the building department arrived to halt the construction and issue citations. The workers, who had no idea they were in the middle of a property dispute, packed up and left. Victoria was livid. She called an emergency community meeting that evening at the clubhouse, mandatory for all residents. I arrived early and took a seat in the front row, much to Victoria's visible displeasure, as she sat up at the podium. Once everyone had assembled, Victoria launched into a carefully crafted narrative about outside investors threatening our community values and the need to protect our precious amenities from exploitation. She presented a resolution authorizing the HOA to take all necessary legal measures to assert control over the lake, including a special assessment of $2,000 per household to fund the legal battle. When she finally opened the floor for comments, the room was tense. Many residents looked uncomfortable but remained silent, conditioned by years of Victoria's retribution against dissenters. I waited, curious to see if anyone would speak up before I had to. To everyone's surprise, it was Derek who stood first. Before we vote on spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on litigation, I think we should see the actual documentation both sides are claiming. As treasurer, I've never seen any deed or agreement that gives the HOA ownership rights to the lake. Victoria tried to cut him off, but others began to voice similar concerns. The dam had broken, and years of suppressed frustration came pouring out. Why does the fishing club charge $2,000 when the actual maintenance costs are a fraction of that? My children have never been allowed to swim in that lake despite us living here for 5 years. Is it true the HOA has been operating without proper financial disclosure? Victoria struggled to regain control of the meeting as more residents found the courage to speak. Finally, when the chaos reached its peak, Greg stepped up to the podium and raised his hands for silence. "This is getting us nowhere," he said firmly. "The fact is, Victoria has documentation that supersedes whatever deed Mr. Reynolds thinks he has. Victoria, show them the agreement." With a triumphant smile, Victoria pulled out a document folder. "This is the original agreement signed by the lake's previous owner, granting perpetual management rights to the HOA. Mr. Reynolds conveniently ignores this binding document in his power play. She dramatically placed the document on the projector, displaying a legal-looking agreement with signatures at the bottom. I studied it carefully, immediately noticing what was missing. "This appears to be only part of the agreement," I said, standing up. "The conditional clauses that were included in the complete document aren't visible here." Victoria scoffed. "There were no conditional clauses. This is the complete agreement." Frank Sullivan slowly rose from his seat. The room quieted. Frank was the most respected elder in the community, and even Victoria couldn't easily dismiss him. "I was there when that agreement was signed," he said, his voice steady. "I was on the HOA board at the time, and Mr. Reynolds is correct. There were very specific conditions attached to the HOA's management rights. Conditions about equal access for all residents and financial transparency." Victoria's face tightened. "With all due respect, Frank, at your age, memories can become confused. This is the official document from our records." Frank smiled kindly. "My memory is just fine, Victoria. So fine, in fact, that I kept my own copy of the complete agreement, which I gave to Mr. Reynolds yesterday." He turned to me. "Nate, would you mind showing the complete document?" The room erupted as I displayed the full agreement on my tablet and passed it around. The missing pages contained all the conditions Frank had mentioned, along with the 5-year renewal clause contingent upon adherence to those conditions. Most damning was the clear language stating that any attempt to restrict access to a subset of residents would render the agreement immediately void. Victoria was cornered, but she had one last card to play. Even if this alternative version is genuine, the HOA has been managing the lake for over 15 years without objection from the previous owner. Under adverse possession laws, that establishes our right to continue management, regardless of original conditions. Alex stood up then. "That would be a creative legal theory, except for 2 facts. First, the owner never abandoned the property, but merely granted conditional usage rights. Second, he regularly expressed concerns about access restrictions, as documented in these letters." He held up a file of correspondence between Mr. Jameson and the HOA, which Frank had preserved. "There was no uncontested 15-year period as required by adverse possession statutes." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. We've invested years and thousands of dollars in that lake. You can't just walk in and take control because of some technical violations of an ancient agreement." The room went silent at her outburst. In that moment, everyone could see what this was really about. Not community standards or property values, but Victoria's personal sense of ownership and control. I spoke quietly into the silence. "I'm not interested in taking control away from the community. I'm interested in returning control to the entire community, not just a select few. The lake should be an amenity everyone can enjoy, not a private playground for those willing to pay exorbitant fees or pledge loyalty to the HOA." The mood in the room had shifted decisively. Even fishing club members were looking at Victoria with new eyes, recognizing how they'd been manipulated. When Greg called for a vote on the special assessment for legal action, it was defeated overwhelmingly, with only Victoria, Greg, and 3 loyal fishing club members voting in favor. As the meeting broke up, Victoria made one final, desperate announcement. "This isn't over. I have other documentation that will settle this matter once and for all. Anyone who sides with Reynolds now will regret it when the truth comes out." The threat hung in the air as she stormed out, Greg hurrying after her, but its power had been broken. Too much had been revealed, too many questions raised about Victoria's leadership and integrity. The community had glimpsed a possibility of something better, and they weren't willing to go back. Derek approached me as people were leaving. "Victoria won't give up easily. She's talking about some document from the original developer that supposedly trumps everything else." I nodded, unsurprised. "Let her try. We'll deal with whatever comes next." What I didn't tell him was that Alex and I had already uncovered every relevant document in the property's history. If Victoria had some secret trump card, it would have surfaced in our research. The community day was scheduled for Saturday, just 2 days away. Despite Victoria's attempts to discourage participation, the response had been overwhelming, with most residents eager to experience free access to the lake for the first time in years. As I walked home that night, I felt cautiously optimistic that the worst was behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I awoke to find my boat missing entirely. In its place was a single blue fishing club flag planted on my dock. The message couldn't have been clearer. Victoria was making her final stand. The theft of my boat was immediately reported to police. By midday, they found it submerged in the shallow waters on the far side of the lake, deliberately sunk by removing the drain plug. Victoria's message was clear. She would cross any line to maintain control. Her desperate action backfired spectacularly. When word spread about the boat sinking, previously neutral residents began offering help. A retired mechanic volunteered to assist with repairs, a family lent me their fishing boat, and several neighbors provided security footage capturing suspicious activity near my dock overnight. Despite this sabotage, Community Day preparations continued. That evening, Derek rushed in with alarming news. Victoria's called an emergency city council meeting for tomorrow morning, same time as Community Day. Greg's convinced the council to consider an emergency measure about the lake. They're trying to have the lake designated as a critical municipal water resource that would place it under city control, he explained. Greg's been calling in favors and making promises to other council members. It was a clever move. If the city claimed the lake under public interest grounds, it would create a legal battle that could drag on for years, during which Victoria could potentially maintain control through her husband's position. We developed a two-pronged plan. Sophia would lead Community Day, while Alex, Derek, Frank, and I attended the council meeting with our documentation and legal arguments. The next morning at City Hall, Victoria and Greg had arrived early, huddled with council members in last-minute lobbying. Greg introduced the emergency measure, framing it as protecting a vital community resource from private exploitation, and painting me as an investor planning to restrict access, exactly opposite to my intentions. When it was our turn, Alex methodically dismantled their legal arguments. I explained my plans for inclusive community access, and Derek revealed the HOA's history of restrictive policies under Victoria's leadership. Frank's testimony proved most powerful. As a resident who had witnessed the community's evolution over decades, his description of how the lake had transformed from a shared resource to an exclusive domain carried significant weight. Sensing defeat, Victoria played her trump card. The original developer signed a letter of intent with the city in 1972, designating the lake as a future municipal resource. She triumphantly produced a yellowed document for the council. After reviewing it briefly, Frank asked to speak again. I remember this letter well. I was on the original planning committee. What Mrs. Powell hasn't mentioned is that this preliminary letter was superseded by the final development agreement 3 months later. Frank produced a comprehensive development agreement that explicitly designated the lake as private property, with a clause stating that the earlier letter of intent was null and void. The council members confirmed that Frank's document indeed overrode Victoria's. Victoria's face drained of color as her last strategy collapsed. The emergency measure was rejected 5-1, with only Greg voting in favor. We headed directly to the lake, where the Community Day was flourishing despite Victoria's efforts to discourage attendance. Nearly the entire neighborhood had turned out, families fishing from shore, children swimming, and small boats dotting the water. The atmosphere was one of genuine community connection many residents hadn't experienced in years. I addressed the gathered community, sharing the council meeting outcome and my vision for the lake's future. This lake belongs to all of us. Not legally, I do own the deed, I said to knowing laughter, but in every way that matters, this is a community resource everyone should enjoy. I proposed creating an elected lake management committee independent from the HOA, with transparent costs based on actual maintenance needs rather than arbitrary fees. Most importantly, every resident would have equal access regardless of HOA standing. The proposal received enthusiastic approval. Even former fishing club members acknowledged the exclusive system had gone too far under Victoria's leadership. Victoria and Greg never appeared. Within a month, they had sold their house and moved to a gated community in another county. The HOA underwent complete restructuring, with Derek elected as president on a platform of transparency and inclusivity. My boat was eventually restored, and I continued my morning sails with new appreciation for the emerging community. The first annual Pinewood Lake fishing tournament that fall raised funds for actual conservation efforts. Families who had lived on the lake for years but never accessed it finally taught their children to swim in waters visible from their windows. Sometimes the best investments aren't about property values, but about community values. Victoria never understood that power comes from bringing people together, not keeping them apart. As I watch sunset over the water, surrounded by neighbors who've become friends, I know I've made the most profitable investment of my career, though its value can't be measured in dollars. And Victoria? I heard her new community has a shared pool managed by the HOA. Something tells me she'll read the fine print more carefully this time.